Hello and welcome to the CoJiT podcast series. As a reminder, the CoJiT podcast series covers issues of contemporary relevance to terrorism and counter-terrorism. My name is Anthony Richards and I'm the editorial director of CoJiT. Today, I'm very pleased to be joined by Dr Elizabeth Grimm, who is an associate teaching professor and director of teaching at the Center for Security Studies at Georgetown University in Washington, DC. Along with Dr. Tricia Bacon, she is co-author of Terror in Transition, Leadership and Succession in Terrorist Organizations, which was published very recently through Columbia University Press. Liz, thank you so much for joining me today.
I have to thank you so much. We are just delighted to speak about the book, and we are so grateful for your time today.
Could I ask firstly, Liz, what were the motivations behind writing the book in the first place, and perhaps on this theme in particular, i.e., of leadership and leadership transition in terrorist organizations?
Absolutely. So we began this project. I feel like every book story is. We began this project years ago, right? So we began this project in the summer of 2018, and our initial interest was to look at the question of leadership in between the ways that we thought leadership had predominantly been studied before in terrorism studies. And by that, I mean the sort of large end studies of the effects of decapitation, and then those sort of singular profiles of individual leaders. And so we actually started this inquiry all the way back with a question about, would we have seen the same very public rupture between al-Qaeda and ISIS if bin Laden were still alive? And so we walked through this counterfactual analysis and sort of simply asked the question, was that rupture due to the effects that we had always thought of as sort of strategic problems, strategic shifts, or did it really have something to do with leadership, the role of leadership? And that counterfactual theorizing really kicked off our interest in the study of leadership, period. And I should say, Anthony, I think the study of leadership is one of those areas in which too much has been written and not enough has been written, right? That there are so many stories of leadership, we think, outside of the field of terrorism itself. And so we richly benefited from treatments of leadership in social movement theory, in organizational management. We even dove into sports management literature, theological literature, to draw on this sort of interdisciplinary body of work to develop theories about under what conditions do leaders actually matter. And so we began this conversation, we began this discussion just about the role of bin Laden himself. You know, would it have been different? Would we have seen a different relationship if bin Laden were still alive between AQ and ISIS, between al-Qaeda and ISIS? And then we dug more deeply into that critical role that founders play in their organization. And we found that the role of founders in terrorist groups had not been significantly explored. I think there's a sort of assumption that of course founders matter, but it hadn't really been significantly treated in literature. And so our book tackles three big questions. And the first big question is, what is the role of a founding leader? What does the leader do? Why is that important? The second one is, what factors shape that successor? And the third is, what are those different types of successors? And again, we found that no significant theorizing had really been done on this in terrorism studies. But again, we benefited on all that research that had been done in other fields that we then examined and applied to this singular question in the field of terrorism. And in particular for our work, it was religious terrorist organizations.
That's fascinating. I mean, as a follow-up to that, really, I mean, what was your sort of conclusion in terms of how things might have panned out differently had bin Laden still been alive?
We found, I know, I love this question, right? We found that they likely would not have had this similar, very public, very fractious split. Right? Bin Laden is a leader who prized above all unity, right? Bringing diverse, disparate individuals together, disparate groups together. Whereas Zawahiri, I mean, we had this sort of treatment of Zawahiri's personality for all the obituaries that have been written over the last several weeks. And all of them have agreed on this sort of same basic tenets of his personality, right? This is a deeply fractious, deeply divisive, I think it was journalist Peter Bergen who said, he is the type of uncle you wouldn't want to sit next to at a Thanksgiving dinner, right? This is not a unifier. And bin Laden went to great lengths to unify the various elements of his organization, knowing, I think, almost sort of anticipating the ways in which he would need a global narrative and then to unite sort of different local grievances underneath that global narrative. And all of the same tensions, many of the same tensions between the personalities within al-Qaeda and within ISIS existed during bin Laden's lifetime. I mean, we know now, based on the recovered documents, about all the letters that had been written between al-Qaeda senior leadership and Zarqawi, himself a, deeply divisive, thuggish jihadist. And yet it was bin Laden's goal to continue to bring Zarqawi into the fold, right? To continue to have him sort of aligned with the organization. And so that counterfactual theorizing really kicked off our interest into this question of what is the role that leaders do play, instead of just looking at it, these sort of polar opposites of books that are just simply exemplar studies of one leader, right? A story of Öcalan, a story of bin Laden, a story of al-Baghdadi, or those large databases. And so we saw for that sort of mid-range theorizing. And then it really generated this interest in what do founders do, right? Why are they so important? And I have to say, Anthony, the business literature here was really significantly helpful because business literature has delved into this greatly, right? So many books were written on Thomas Edison, for example, right? And the role that he played in sort of merging his own personality into the organization. We even delved into psychological literature and individuals like Sigmund Freud creating a psychological movement and how he vested in his subsequent followers the identity that he wanted, the framing that he wanted. And so we use so much of that literature to generate our own theory about founders and then their subsequent successors.
That's fantastic. It sounds really interesting how you sort of drawn on different disciplines here to inform your work. I think, sounds to, very good example of a sort of an interdisciplinary approach. I wonder, in the course of your research, I wonder if you could elaborate perhaps and outline what the implications are for policy making from your research.
So at the most brief level, what our conclusions were that founders create the how and the why. So they generate essentially why fight, why engage in violence. And then they also generate the how. How do you do that? You do that through tactics. You do that through resource mobilization. And so the founders have that baseline. And then every successor positions themselves relative to the founder. Some don't change anything, right? So those are what we would call caretakers. And when I say don't change anything, we mean they keep things essentially the same as what the founders had intended, what the founders had wanted. And so they make only sort of minimal changes to the how and the why. Then we have fixers, and we argue that fixers change the how. So they could change some aspect of either the tactics. So they might move to suicide bombing if the founder had not initially carved that into the repertoire of action, or they could move to brand new areas to exploit for wealth, for resource mobilization, or new recruitment tactics. But they keep the why the same, the why fight, the framing, the reason for being. Then we argued there were signalers, and signalers changed the why, but not the how. And what this often looked like in changing the why is groups that then would change from a local grievance to merging with al-Qaeda or merging with ISIS. So sort of shifting the why, shifting the focus of the violence. Then we had visionaries, and visionaries changed both the how and the why. The last group that we looked at, were figureheads. Figureheads are sort of like a ship without a captain. They, either for health reasons or because they are imprisoned, they're actively choosing not to lead. And I give that background only to say that within each of these archetypes that we identified, there are different points of exploitation. There's sort of different lessons to learn for policymakers. And part of the reason that, and as all of your listeners are well aware, that decapitation literature is divisive with different findings and different conclusions, one of our arguments for that is because the role of successors is not well understood. And so our first conclusion is that it is impossible. You can hear my dog whining in the background because we're not talking about him. One of the findings is that role of the founder cannot be overestimated. The founder's background, their training, their social ties with their religious community, with their social community, that organizing ability, those are all factors that help them mobilize the resources necessary to engage in violence. And so at the most basic level, ours is a message to counterterrorism policymakers and counterterrorism scholars to dig deeply into the founders themselves, to understand the way the founders are creating the how and the why for their organizations. And again, just as a callback to our earlier point, I would argue that all founders do this, right? All founders create a how and the why for their organization. But that mobilization of resources to the end of violence is the particular area of concern for us. And so to the question of how this all matters for policy, we argue there are significant implications for targeting insofar as we look at these different categories of successors. And so we are not arguing that counterterrorism efforts should focus just on leaders or just on founders. We argue that it is one element of a comprehensive counter-terror approach. In fact, one of the case studies that we examined was the case of the Second Klan that was active in the United States in the 1920s. In that case, extremism was operating in very close proximity to society. And so what that case demonstrated is it was actually heightened social acceptability and the destigmatization of extremism that plays a much more pivotal role in degrading the organization than targeting the leader themselves. And so it's important also to consider that sort of environment that the group is operating in. But we said there are specific recommendations for each archetype. And the first is with regards to a caretaker. Remember, caretakers, these are the leaders, they are just keeping the trains running, right? They are not deviating in a disruptive sense from the how or from the why. And this conservative style of leadership, we argue, can expose an organization to effectively be poorly transitioned to cope with change, right? Poorly transitioned to recruit new members, to advertise their mission to a new sense of sort of would-be constituents. And so there are opportunities there to exploit a leader who's sort of out of keeping with where the organization might need to go. With regards to fixers, signalers, and visionaries. Again, fixers, they change the how, signalers change the why, visionaries change both. We argue there are significant opportunities to discredit those leaders by highlighting the hypocrisy, or in some cases, even the betrayal of that organization's founding frames and founding methods. I would argue of all the organizations that we studied, it is visionaries who have the greatest potential to be divisive leaders. You know, visionaries can often heal a group that is struggling, or they can further rupture a group that is struggling. And so there is an opportunity to drive a significant wedge between that leader, its allies, and the group's constituency. And the last group that we studied, or last set of leaders that we studied, are these figureheads, right? These are groups without a leader, groups that are effectively directionless. And so there is an opportunity there to exploit a group that has become adrift, or a group that is rife with divisions. And so there might be utility there, even to leaving a figurehead leader in place, right? Despite a clear policy preference, at least in the United States, for leadership decapitation. So our argument sort of at the most basic level is, it's important to know what type of leader you are facing and to have that be a significant driver into the targeting policy.
Are there any examples that you've identified of groups where there are clear succession plans in place, and perhaps other groups where the opposite is the case?
Absolutely. So at the most basic level, you know, successions, these are pivotal moments for any organization, right? They're times of confusion, internal competition, and disruption. And there are some organizations that take great pains to lay out in advance what those plans are going to be to minimize that potential for disruption, particularly in organizations in which the very existence of that organization is a threat, right? You know that you are assuming a risk by being a member of this organization. And so in some cases, for example, with regards to al-Qaeda is probably the best example here. It was well known for years who the longtime deputy and successor would be for Bin Laden. Even though, again, he was a man, a deeply divisive, fractious person you wouldn't want to sit next to at a Thanksgiving dinner, it was long assumed that Bin Laden's longtime deputy, Zawahiri, would assume the reins in the event of Bin Laden's death. And it should also be noted, Bin Laden is a terrorist founder who took great lengths to essentially divorce his own personality and his own charisma for the organization himself, because he wanted the organization to survive him. Now, I would actually paint a different picture with regards to a group like Shinrikyo, right, in which Shoka Ashihara vests his entire personality, his identity, into the crafting of the how and the why. So al-Qaeda is a great example of a group that has a clear succession plan, or at least did have a clear succession plan. Other groups, I would say it's quite murky, right? And one of the organizations that we studied in our in-depth case study was the case of al-Shabaab. This is an organization that has twice sort of actually confounded counterterrorism observers, counterterrorism scholars and practitioners in choosing dark horse candidates. So in the case of Shabaab, first when they named the reclusive Ahmed Abdi Godani as their leader in August of 2007, and then again after Godani's death in 2014, the executive council then unanimously names Abu Ubaidah as the emir. And so one of our arguments in the book is that it is helpful to know the bench, right? It is helpful to know who the likely successors are, but that will often not tell the whole story about succession. And again, the case of Shabaab is illustrative of this, in which they've twice chose individuals who are sort of relative dark horses for succession.
You mentioned Zawahiri, actually. Of course, al-Zawahiri, he was killed in July this
Right.
year. I wonder if you could tell us something perhaps about the impact of his death, not just on al-Qaeda as a whole, but I guess in terms of leadership transition too.
Absolutely. And one of the things that we noted just a few minutes ago, Dr. Bacon and I have worked on this book for years. In fact, the very first sentences of our book are the question of whether Zawahiri is alive or dead, because it was unknown actually at the time that the book went to press whether he was alive or dead. We now have it confirmed, right? He was killed in July of this year. And we would argue that despite all of the commentary of Zawahiri as uncharismatic, as fractious, this is an individual who is a steadfast steward of bin Laden's vision, a steadfast steward. And in fact, we argue in the book, Zawahiri is what we would call almost an archetypal caretaker, right? To the point that if bin Laden had been alive 2 years ago, he likely would have been a happy man with where the state of al-Qaeda was under the stewardship of Zawahiri. And so this is in no small part given Zawahiri's invocation that al-Qaeda avoid the sort of mass casualty attacks that ISIS was engaged in. This was a Zawahiri who expanded and strengthened al-Qaeda's presence in Yemen, in Syria, in sub-Saharan Africa. But that question about, what kind of leader was he for the group and where does al-Qaeda go next? I think that is the central question. And again, knowing the personality of the individual only really tells you so much. Zawahiri was a very different leader of al-Qaeda than he was of the previous group that he was a leader of, which is the Egyptian Islamic Jihad, right? During his tenure as the emir of the Egyptian Islamic Jihad, he engaged in a series of terrorist attacks in Egypt that alienated his constituency, that exacerbated internal divisions, that provoked intense and deep CT counterterrorism pressure against him and the group, which forced the Egyptian Islamic Jihad to abandon its founding vision, right? To abandon that goal that it once had. And so what Zawahiri did is that he continued the how and the why that bin Laden set up, I would argue, very, very effectively, right? So then there is debate, and I think the question has a two-part answer, right? Who is going to rise to that top spot, and what is actually next for al-Qaeda? And just as I said, this is a pivotal moment for this organization. And so there's long been speculation about Saif al-Adil, right? This sort of long-time veteran Egyptian fighter. This is an individual, he was once tasked to work with the equally abrasive Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, right? His deep experience as a military operative, deep experience in operational planning. And should be noted, he was opposed to the attacks of 9/11, right? Given his knowledge about operational planning. This is an individual that it's possible that if Saif al-Adil took the reins of AQ, that he would serve as a fixer for the organization, that he would change the how of where al-Qaeda might be going. There's other speculation, for example, about Abd al-Rahman al-Maghribi, right? So he is the head of al-Qaeda's media committee. And part of this speculation is the fact that he's Zawahiri's son-in-law, right? So this would reflect a familial relationship similar to the one that once made Hamza bin Laden, Osama Bin Laden, that sort of potential heir in waiting, right? That eligible heir before his death. This is something that we have studied extensively in the book as well, about how simply authority and prestige can be handed down. But one of the points that Tricia and I have cautioned again, and we brought it up in the case already in the podcast about Shabaab, is that it is important to pay attention to dark horse successors as well. And so we argue that it'd be important to pay attention to someone like Amin Hamad Khan, right? That sort of former security coordinator for Bin Laden, this individual who was the head of the Black Guard, was a medical doctor, also abrasive. But the potential for Khan, and why I think he could be appealing, is that he would be the first non-Arab leader, and that he could be a possible visionary new successor for the group. And the reason that we sort of argue that it's important to pay attention to someone like him is that al-Qaeda is really at a pivotal moment right now, and it has been losing adherents for years. And so having someone who's a visionary leader, again, visionary leaders in changing the how and the why, they reflect or they could create divisions in the organization. But someone like a Khan, first non-Arab leader, could be someone who could bring a sort of necessary new energy to the organization and to help sort of recruit additional individuals back into the fold in ways that would be regenerative for al-Qaeda in this, now what, third decade of its existence, right? So to sort of create a sort of revitalized energy around the group.
Thank you so much for joining me today and for sharing some of these models of leadership that you've discussed today. And I wish you all the very best with the book. And thank you to all our listeners for listening. Goodbye.
Thank you so much for your time. Have a good day.